Climate Finance. For a Sustainable Future. Course Contents. Introduction to Climate Finance. The Science and Economics of Climate Change. Global Frameworks and Agreements. Public Sources of Climate Finance. Private Sector and Market-Based Approaches. Green Bonds and Sustainable Investing. Climate Risk and Financial Disclosure. Innovative Financial Instruments. Role of Multilateral Development Banks. Climate Finance in Developing Countries. Case Studies of Successful Climate Finance Projects. Climate Finance and the Role of Youth and Future Generations. Toward a Climate-Resilient Financial Future. Part 1. Introduction to Climate Finance. What is climate finance? Climate finance refers to local, national, or transnational financing drawn from public, private, and alternative sources that is used to support mitigation and adaptation actions addressing climate change. In essence, it is the financial mechanism that powers the global response to climate challenges. Whether it's funding renewable energy projects, retrofitting infrastructure, or helping vulnerable communities adapt to shifting environmental patterns, climate finance plays a pivotal role in the global transition towards sustainability. The need for climate finance stems from the vast economic and social implications of climate change. As global temperatures rise, so too do the costs associated with extreme weather events, sea level rise, ecosystem degradation, and economic disruptions. Climate finance is not just about money, it's about shaping the future we want to live in. Importance of climate finance. The global response to climate change hinges on the availability and effective deployment of climate finance. Here are some key reasons why it's essential. Enabling transition helps economies shift from fossil fuels to clean energy sources. Building resilience supports adaptation in communities most vulnerable to climate impacts. Promoting equity assists developing nations that contribute least to climate change but suffer the most from its effects. Mobilizing innovation drives technological advancement in clean energy, agriculture, transport, and industry. Reducing risk encourages private investment by mitigating the financial risks of green projects. Historical context and evolution. The concept of climate finance emerged in the late 20th century as scientists and policymakers began to understand the magnitude of climate change. Initially, efforts focused on grants and aid from developed to developing countries. Over time, the scope expanded to include loans, equity investments, carbon markets, and green bonds. Key milestones in the evolution of climate finance include 1992, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change (UNFCCC) recognized the need for financial support. 1997, Kyoto Protocol introduced mechanisms like the Clean Development Mechanism (CDM). 2010, creation of the Green Climate Fund (GCF) to channel billions in climate-related finance. 2015, Paris Agreement solidified the global commitment to mobilize $100 billion annually for climate action in developing countries by 2020, a goal still under negotiation and progress. Major stakeholders in climate finance. Climate finance involves a broad spectrum of actors including governments, through national budgets, climate funds, and international cooperation. Development banks, such as the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and African Development Bank. Private sector, corporations, institutional investors, banks, and insurance firms. Multilateral institutions, including the UN, IMF, and Green Climate Fund. Civil society and NGOs, advocating for transparency, equity, and environmental justice. Key concepts in climate finance. To fully understand climate finance, it's important to become familiar with a few foundational concepts. Mitigation versus adaptation. Mitigation refers to efforts to reduce or prevent greenhouse gas emissions, while adaptation involves adjusting systems and societies to withstand climate impacts. Blended finance. the strategic use of public or philanthropic funds to mobilize private capital for climate projects. Carbon pricing, putting a cost on carbon emissions through taxes or trading systems to incentivize reductions. Climate resilience, the capacity of communities and ecosystems to absorb climate shocks and bounce back stronger. Just transition, ensuring the move to a green economy is fair and inclusive, particularly for workers and communities reliant on fossil fuels. Looking ahead. Climate finance is one of the most critical tools in the global fight against climate change. It is dynamic, evolving, and intrinsically tied to political will, innovation and cooperation across borders. As we explore this field in more detail throughout the course, we'll examine not only how climate finance works but also how it can be scaled and made more effective in driving a sustainable future for all. Part 2. The Science and Economics of Climate Change. The science behind climate change. Climate change is driven primarily by the accumulation of greenhouse gases (GHGs) in the atmosphere, especially carbon dioxide (CO), methane (CH), and nitrous oxide (NO). These gases trap heat from the sun, creating a greenhouse effect that warms the planet. Key scientific facts. Since the Industrial Revolution, atmospheric CO levels have risen from about 280 parts per million to over 420 ppm. Global temperatures have increased by approximately 1.1 degrees Celsius since pre-industrial times. Sea levels are rising at an accelerating rate due to melting glaciers and thermal expansion of water. Extreme weather events such as droughts, floods, and heatwaves are becoming more frequent and intense. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, a body of thousands of scientists worldwide, has consistently warned that without significant cuts in GHG emissions, the planet will face catastrophic and irreversible changes. Economic impacts of climate change. The economic consequences of climate change are broad and deep. They affect virtually every sector of the global economy, including agriculture, energy, health, infrastructure, and trade. Major economic risks include damage to infrastructure. Floods, hurricanes, and heatwaves can destroy roads, bridges, and buildings. Reduced agricultural productivity. Unpredictable weather patterns affect crop yields and food security. Health costs. Increased disease outbreaks, heat-related illnesses, and pollution-related conditions raise healthcare expenditures. Displacement and migration. Rising sea levels and desertification can force communities to relocate, causing social and economic disruptions. Loss of ecosystem services. Coral reefs, forests, and wetlands provide crucial services, such as water filtration, pollination, and carbon sequestration, that are at risk. The Stern Review on the Economics of Climate Change 2006 concluded that the costs of inaction far exceed the costs of immediate action. It estimated that if climate change is not addressed, it could cost the global economy up to 20% of GDP annually. The cost of action versus inaction. Mitigating and adapting to climate change involves upfront investments, but the benefits far outweigh the costs. Economists generally categorize costs in two ways. Mitigation costs, transitioning to renewable energy, upgrading infrastructure, and developing low-carbon technologies. Adaptation costs, building flood defenses, climate-proofing infrastructure, enhancing water security, and protecting vulnerable populations. On the other hand, inaction results in higher disaster recovery costs, long-term productivity losses, greater income inequality, irreversible damage to ecosystems. Numerous studies have shown that every dollar invested in climate resilience can yield multiple dollars in avoided losses and economic returns. Economic tools for climate action. Economics plays a central role in designing and implementing climate policy. Several tools are used to align economic activity with environmental goals. Carbon pricing includes carbon taxes and cap-and-trade systems to internalize the cost of emissions. Subsidies and incentives encouraging the adoption of clean energy, electric vehicles, and energy-efficient buildings. Polluter pays principle ensures that those responsible for pollution bear the costs of managing it. Cost-benefit analysis (CBA) used to evaluate the trade-offs of climate policies and investments. Discount rates. In climate economics, discounting future costs and benefits is contentious. Lower discount rates emphasize long-term impacts and intergenerational equity. Climate risk and financial markets. Climate change introduces two major categories of risk into financial systems. Physical risks arise from climate-related disasters that damage assets, disrupt supply chains, and impair business operations. Transition risks linked to the shift toward a low-carbon economy, including changes in regulations, market preferences, and technologies. Investors and regulators are increasingly concerned with these risks, pushing for better climate-related financial disclosures and stress testing of assets. Valuing nature and ecosystem services. Traditional economic models often undervalue nature. However, ecosystems provide vital services, such as carbon storage, flood control, and biodiversity, that have immense, often unpriced economic value. Incorporating the value of nature into national accounting systems and investment decisions is crucial for sustainability. This includes tools like natural capital accounting and payments for ecosystem services (PAYS). Conclusion. Understanding the science and economics of climate change is foundational for effective climate finance. It helps policymakers, investors, and communities recognize the urgency of action, the costs of inaction, and the economic opportunities embedded in a green transition. As we move forward in this course, we'll explore how finance can be mobilized to support a sustainable and resilient global economy, backed by both scientific evidence and sound economic reasoning. Part 3: Global Frameworks and Agreements. The role of international cooperation. Climate change is a global problem that transcends borders. Its impacts are felt worldwide, and its solutions require coordinated efforts among countries, institutions, and stakeholders. International frameworks and agreements serve as the foundation for climate finance by setting shared goals, creating accountability, and mobilizing financial resources. These agreements often include provisions for technology transfer, capacity building, climate adaptation and mitigation funding, transparency and reporting mechanisms. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. Adopted in 1992 at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, the UNFCCC is the cornerstone of international climate policy. It established a framework for negotiating specific treaties, or protocols and agreements, aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Key elements of the UNFCCC. Recognizes the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, CBDR. Establishes obligations for developed countries to support developing countries financially and technologically. Laid the foundation for subsequent agreements like the Kyoto Protocol and Paris Agreement. The Kyoto Protocol, 1997. The Kyoto Protocol, adopted in 1997 and entered into force in 2005, was the first binding agreement under the UNFCCC that required industrialized countries to reduce GHG emissions. Key features. Set binding emission reduction targets for 37 industrialized countries. Introduced 3 flexible mechanisms. Clean Development Mechanism, CDM. Joint Implementation, G. Emissions Trading, ET. Encouraged project-based climate finance by allowing emission reduction credits to be traded and used to meet national targets. Although it was a pioneering effort, the Kyoto Protocol faced criticism for its limited participation, notably the US never ratified it, and for excluding developing countries from binding targets. The Paris Agreement, 2015. The Paris Agreement marked a historic shift in global climate governance. Adopted by 196 countries at COP21 in Paris, it aims to limit global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius, ideally 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Achieve a balance between emissions and removals, net zero, in the second half of the century. Enhance adaptive capacity, resilience and low-emission development. Finance related commitments in the Paris Agreement. Developed countries reaffirmed their commitment to mobilize $100 billion per year by 2020, extended through 2025 for developing countries. Financial flows must be consistent with low GHG emissions and climate-resilient development. Emphasis on transparency, reporting and climate finance tracking. The Green Climate Fund (GCF). Established in 2010 under the UNFCCC framework, the Green Climate Fund is the largest multilateral climate finance institution, focused on supporting developing countries. Objectives: fund projects in mitigation and adaptation. Prioritize vulnerable regions, least developed countries, small island developing states and African states. Promote private sector engagement through a dedicated facility. As of now, the GCF has approved billions in financing across hundreds of projects globally, often using blended finance models to attract additional investment. Other key international frameworks. Sustainable Development Goals (SDGs). Adopted in 2015, the SDGs include Goal 13, Climate Action, which reinforces the importance of financing for climate resilience, emissions reduction and sustainable development. Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. Emphasizes investment in disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation, aligning well with climate finance goals. The Glasgow Climate Pact, COP26 2021. Reaffirmed the $100 billion target and called for a doubling of adaptation finance by 2025. It also emphasized the need to align financial systems and regulations with climate goals. Sharm el-Sheikh Implementation Plan, COP27 2022. Focused heavily on loss and damage, an emerging area of climate finance that aims to compensate countries facing irreversible climate impacts. A fund was agreed upon, though operationalism remains in progress. Regional and bilateral climate finance initiatives. Beyond global agreements, many regional frameworks and bilateral partnerships also support climate finance, including EU Green Deal and European Investment Bank (EIB) financing for climate projects. China's Belt and Road Initiative (BRI) integrating green finance principles. Germany's International Climate Initiative, ICI, and UK's International Climate Finance Programme. Climate-specific partnerships like the NDC Partnership and Insu-Resilience Global Partnership. Challenges in global coordination. Despite these frameworks, global climate finance still faces hurdles. Underfunding. The $100 billion goal remains unmet. Imbalance. More funding goes to mitigation than adaptation. Access barriers. Complex procedures for accessing funds, especially for least developed countries. Transparency issues. Lack of clarity around what counts as climate finance. Geopolitical tensions. Differences in responsibility and capability among countries often stall negotiations. Conclusion. Global climate frameworks and agreements form the legal, institutional, and political backbone of climate finance. They define responsibilities, set targets, and drive the flow of capital from wealthier nations to those most in need. However, the success of these agreements lies in their implementation, ensuring promises translate into action. The next parts will explore how public and private actors operationalize these commitments and scale up finance for a climate-resilient future. Part 4: Public Sources of Climate Finance. Overview of public climate finance. Public finance forms the bedrock of climate action, especially in developing countries where private capital may be scarce or risk-averse. Governments, multilateral institutions, and public development banks provide critical funding for mitigation and adaptation initiatives, helping to de-risk investments and catalyze broader financial flows. Public climate finance supports national and local governments in implementing climate policies. Infrastructure development for clean energy, transportation and water systems. Capacity building and technology transfer. Vulnerable populations through adaptation and resilience programs. National government expenditures. Many countries allocate domestic public resources to climate action through national climate budgets or green budget tagging. Dedicated climate funds, e.g., India's National Adaptation Fund for Climate Change. Subsidies and incentives for renewable energy, energy efficiency and conservation. Regulatory and fiscal tools, such as tax credits and feed-in tariffs. Incorporating climate into national financial planning ensures coherence between policy and budget, a practice encouraged by organizations like the IMF and World Bank. International public climate finance. International public climate finance refers to money flowing from developed to developing countries through bilateral and multilateral channels. These funds are often grants or concessional loans with favorable terms. Key sources include bilateral donors. Countries like Germany, Japan, the UK, France and the Nordic nations contribute significantly to climate finance. Official Development Assistance, ODA. Climate-relevant ODA includes funding for clean energy, water management, agriculture and disaster resilience. Dedicated climate funds. Special-purpose vehicles created to channel and coordinate international climate finance, see below. Major climate funds. Green Climate Fund (GCF), established by the UNFCCC in 2010, supports both mitigation and adaptation projects in developing countries. Uses a results-based framework. Prioritizes the most vulnerable regions, LDCs, SIDS, African states. Global Environment Facility (GEF), operational since 1991. Funds projects in biodiversity, climate change, land degradation and international waters. Functions as a financial mechanism for multiple multilateral environmental agreements, MEES. Climate Investment Funds (CIF). Administered by the World Bank. Includes programs like Clean Technology Fund (CTF), Strategic Climate Fund (SCF). Focuses on large-scale transformational investments. Adaptation Fund. Financed by a share of proceeds from the Clean Development Mechanism, CDM. Supports projects that increase climate resilience, particularly in developing countries. Multilateral Development Banks, MDBs. MDBs play a central role in financing climate-related development, especially through concessional loans, grants, technical assistance and co-financing. They also help countries prepare project pipelines and strengthen institutional capacity. Leading MDBs in climate finance. World Bank Group. Asian Development Bank, ADB. African Development Bank, AFDB. Inter-American Development Bank, IDB. European Investment Bank, EIB. In 2022, MDBs reported over $60 billion in climate finance, with a growing emphasis on alignment with the Paris Agreement. The role of national development banks, NDBs. Many countries have national development banks that contribute significantly to climate goals. These institutions understand local markets and can fill gaps that international institutions might overlook. Examples: Brazil's BNDES, Banco Nacional de Desenvolvimento Econômico e Social. India's SIDBI, Small Industries Development Bank of India. Indonesia's Point SMI, Sarana Multi-Infrastructure. NDBs are increasingly mobilizing domestic resources, issuing green bonds and leveraging international climate finance. Budgeting and tracking climate finance. Governments and institutions are adopting systems to track, tag and report climate expenditures. These include climate public expenditure and institutional reviews (CPEIRs), climate budget tagging (CBT) frameworks, integrated financial planning tools for climate and development goals. Such tools enhance transparency, accountability, and policy alignment. Challenges in public climate finance. While public finance is essential, it faces several hurdles. Underfunding. The $100 billion annual goal for developing countries remains unmet. Slow disbursement. Complex approval processes delay project implementation. Inequitable access. Least developed countries and small island states often struggle to access funds. Monitoring and impact. Measuring the effectiveness of public finance is difficult without strong reporting systems. Addressing these challenges requires governance reforms, capacity building, and streamlined access procedures. Leveraging public finance to attract private investment. Public climate finance often plays a catalytic role in unlocking private capital. Instruments such as guarantees, first loss capital, technical assistance grants, co-financing arrangements help reduce investment risks and improve project bankability. This blended approach is crucial for scaling up finance in sectors like renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, and climate-resilient infrastructure. Conclusion. Public finance remains a critical pillar of global climate action. It not only provides essential resources for direct interventions, but also lays the foundation for broader financial mobilization. As we transition to more complex financing ecosystems, public funds will continue to play a leading role in ensuring climate equity, enabling innovation and building resilience where it's needed most. Part 5. Private sector and market-based approaches. Introduction to private climate finance. While public finance plays a foundational role in addressing climate change, the private sector holds the scale of capital required to meet the enormous funding needs for climate action. According to estimates, trillions of dollars in investment are needed annually to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. This makes private finance not just desirable but essential for both climate mitigation and adaptation. Private sector actors include commercial banks, institutional investors, pension funds, insurance companies, asset managers, corporations and SMEs, venture capital and private equity funds. These players invest in clean energy, green infrastructure, sustainable agriculture, and emerging climate technologies, often in partnership with public institutions. Key private financing instruments. Private sector investment in climate action uses a range of financial tools, including debt financing, loans and bonds used to fund climate projects. Equity investments. Private investors take ownership stakes in green ventures, often through funds. Green bonds. Fixed income instruments where proceeds are earmarked for environmentally friendly projects. Sustainability-linked loans and bonds. Financial products tied to a company's achievement of climate or ESG targets. Venture capital. Invests in innovative startups, especially in clean tech and climate solutions. The rise of green bonds. Green bonds are among the most widely used market-based tools to finance climate projects. First issued by the World Bank in 2008, the green bond market has grown to over $500 billion in annual issuances globally. Key features. Funds must be used for eligible green projects, e.g., renewable energy, energy efficiency, clean transportation. Issuers include governments, corporations, banks, and international organizations. Guided by frameworks such as the Green Bond Principles (GBP). Benefits. Attract ESG-focused investors. Provide transparency and accountability. Create opportunities for long-term low-cost financing. Carbon markets and pricing mechanisms. Market-based mechanisms such as carbon pricing are critical to aligning financial incentives with climate goals. Two main approaches dominate. 1. Carbon taxes. Governments levy a fee per ton of CO emitted. Creates a financial incentive to reduce emissions. 2. Emissions trading systems (ETS). Cap-and-trade systems set an emissions cap and allow entities to buy/sell allowances. The EU ETS is the most established, covering power, industry, and aviation sectors. Voluntary carbon markets (VCMs) also allow companies and individuals to offset emissions by purchasing carbon credits from projects that remove or avoid GHG emissions, e.g., afforestation, methane capture, renewable energy. ESG and climate risk integration. The rise of environmental, social, and governance (ESG) investing is reshaping capital markets. Investors increasingly consider climate risk in portfolio decisions, driven by physical risks, extreme weather, sea level rise; transition risks, policy changes, technology shifts, reputation. Climate risk disclosure frameworks include Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures (TCFD), Sustainability Accounting Standards Board (SASB), EU Taxonomy and Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation (SFDR). These tools promote transparency and enable investors to assess climate resilience in their investments. Blended finance, public-private synergy. Blended finance is the strategic use of public and philanthropic capital to mobilize private investment in climate solutions. It helps de-risk projects and make them more attractive to private investors. Common blended finance instruments. Concessional loans, below-market rate loans from public entities. Guarantees, risk mitigation tools that protect investors against losses. First loss capital, public investors take the first losses, protecting private capital. Example: the Climate Finance Lab has supported innovative blended finance vehicles like the Agriculture Finance Facility, which provides climate-resilient funding for smallholder farmers. Corporate climate action and net zero commitments. Corporations are increasingly setting net zero targets and investing in decarbonization. Key trends include renewable energy procurement, e.g., power purchase agreements. Electrification of fleets and supply chains. Carbon offsetting and insetting. Internal carbon pricing. Major firms across sectors, from tech giants to oil companies, are now embedding climate goals into their business models, driven by regulation, investor pressure, and consumer expectations. Financial innovation in climate markets. The private sector is also driving innovation in financial products to support climate solutions, including green securitization, pooling green assets like rooftop solar loans into investable securities. Climate risk insurance, products designed to protect communities and businesses from climate shocks. Climate fintech, startups using technology to create new models for climate investing and carbon accounting. Transition finance, funding for carbon-intensive industries to shift toward lower emissions practices. Challenges in mobilizing private climate finance. Despite strong momentum, challenges remain. Risk perception. Many green projects, especially in developing countries, are seen as high risk. Lack of bankable projects, weak pipelines, and limited capacity hinder investment readiness. Policy uncertainty. Regulatory instability discourages long-term investment. Greenwashing. Lack of standards and oversight can undermine credibility. Overcoming these barriers requires public-private collaboration, improved data and disclosure, and robust policy frameworks. 5.10 Conclusion. Private sector participation is vital to scaling climate finance globally. Market-based instruments like green bonds, carbon pricing, and blended finance are helping to align financial flows with the climate agenda. As financial institutions, businesses, and investors deepen their commitment to sustainability, they not only reduce their own risks, but also play a transformative role in shaping a low-carbon, climate-resilient global economy. Part 6: Climate Finance for Adaptation and Resilience. Understanding climate adaptation and resilience. Climate adaptation refers to adjustments in ecological, social, or economic systems in response to actual or expected climate stimuli. Unlike mitigation, which focuses on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, adaptation deals with coping with the impacts of climate change. Climate resilience refers to the ability of communities, economies, and ecosystems to withstand and recover from climate shocks, such as floods, droughts, sea level rise, and extreme weather events. Investing in adaptation and resilience is essential to protect vulnerable populations and assets, reduce long-term economic losses, maintain social and ecological stability, enhance food, water, and energy security. The adaptation finance gap. Despite the growing risks, adaptation finance is critically underfunded. According to the UNEP Adaptation Gap Report, developing countries require up to $300 billion annually by 2030 for adaptation. Current adaptation finance flows are only a fraction of that need. Less than 25% of total climate finance is directed toward adaptation. Closing the adaptation gap is imperative, especially for the least developed countries, LDCs, and small island developing states, SIDS, that are highly exposed and have limited resources. Sources of adaptation finance. 1. Public international finance. Green Climate Fund, GCF, allocates 50% of its resources to adaptation with a focus on the most vulnerable countries. Adaptation Fund, financed by carbon markets, e.g., Clean Development Mechanism and donor contributions. Global Environment Facility, GEF, funds projects in water management, agriculture, and climate-smart development. 2. Bilateral and multilateral donors. Countries such as Germany, the UK, Japan, and the Nordic nations have dedicated adaptation programs. MDBs, e.g., World Bank ADB, finance large-scale resilience infrastructure projects. 3. National and local governments. Countries develop national adaptation plans, NAPs, and allocate budgetary support for resilience efforts. Local governments may access funds through climate resilience trust funds and donor grants. Adaptation sectors and investment areas. Adaptation finance supports a wide range of sectors and interventions. These interventions not only reduce vulnerability, but also offer co-benefits like job creation, food security, and environmental conservation. Community-based adaptation, CBA. Community-based adaptation empowers local communities to design and implement adaptation strategies that reflect their needs and contexts. Key principles: participatory planning and local ownership, integration of indigenous knowledge and practices, gender-sensitive and inclusive approaches, small grants and microfinance support. Example: in Bangladesh, local communities build floating gardens and elevated homes to cope with floods and sea level rise. Role of insurance and risk transfer mechanisms. Innovative climate risk insurance products are emerging as critical tools for adaptation, helping vulnerable groups recover from climate shocks. Examples include index-based crop insurance for farmers, parametric insurance for hurricanes and droughts, sovereign disaster risk pools like African Risk Capacity, ARC, Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, CCRIF. These instruments offer rapid payouts and improve financial resilience at multiple levels. Private sector involvement in adaptation. Private investment in adaptation is still limited due to difficulties in monetizing returns, lack of clear revenue streams, Perceived low bankability of adaptation projects. However, private actors can contribute by climate-proofing supply chains and assets, investing in resilient agriculture and water systems, developing insurance and climate risk analytics. Blended finance and public guarantees can help de-risk and attract private capital to adaptation efforts. Tracking and measuring adaptation finance. Unlike mitigation, which can be quantified via emissions reductions, measuring adaptation impacts is more complex. Efforts are underway to improve tracking methodologies, e.g., OECD DAC Rio markers, CPI climate finance tracking. Results frameworks for assessing resilience outcomes. Standardization in defining adaptation finance. The Paris Agreement's global goal on adaptation calls for improved measurement, transparency, and accountability in adaptation finance. Challenges in scaling adaptation finance. Key barriers include low visibility and prioritization compared to mitigation, insufficient funding, and fragmented delivery mechanisms, institutional and technical capacity constraints, difficulty in accessing international climate funds. Addressing these challenges requires integrated national planning, capacity building, simplified access to finance, and strong political will. Conclusion: climate adaptation and resilience are critical for safeguarding lives, livelihoods, and development gains in the face of growing climate threats. While adaptation finance remains underfunded, there is a growing recognition of its importance. Unlocking both public and private resources, along with inclusive, locally driven strategies, is key to building a climate-resilient world. Part 7: Carbon Markets and Carbon Finance. Introduction to carbon markets. Carbon markets are systems designed to put a price on carbon emissions, allowing countries, companies, and organizations to trade emission allowances or credits. These markets form a crucial component of climate finance by creating economic incentives to reduce greenhouse gas (GHG) emissions. Carbon markets aim to drive cost-effective emissions reductions, mobilize finance for climate mitigation, support sustainable development in developing countries, encourage innovation in low-carbon technologies. There are two main types: compliance, regulated markets, voluntary carbon markets, VCMs. Compliance carbon markets. Compliance markets are created by governmental or intergovernmental regulations to ensure adherence to emission reduction commitments. Examples of compliance markets: European Union Emissions Trading System (EU ETS), the world's largest carbon market, covering power, industrial, and aviation sectors. China's national ETS, launched in 2021, covers over 4 billion tons of CO emissions. California Cap and Trade Program includes industries and utilities in the state. Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative (RGGI) covers power plants in several U.S. states. How they work. A cap is set on total emissions. Emission allowances are distributed or auctioned. Entities can trade these allowances to stay within limits. The cap decreases over time, tightening emissions. Voluntary carbon markets, VCMs. VCMs operate outside of regulatory frameworks and allow entities to offset their carbon footprint by purchasing carbon credits generated from emissions-reducing projects. Buyers include corporations with net zero goals, individuals aiming to offset personal emissions, event organizers, airlines, and others seeking carbon neutrality. Sellers are project developers implementing reforestation and afforestation, renewable energy projects, methane capture, soil carbon sequestration, clean cooking stoves. 1 carbon credit equals 1 metric ton of CO equivalent avoided or removed. Standards and certification. To ensure credibility and integrity, carbon credits must be verified by third-party standards. These standards evaluate whether a project is additional, wouldn't happen without carbon finance, measurable, permanent, verifiable, free of leakage, emission increases elsewhere. Major standards include VERA (VCS) Verified Carbon Standard, Gold Standard, Climate Action Reserve (CAR), American Carbon Registry (ACR). Each project undergoes monitoring, reporting, and third-party validation. Carbon finance mechanisms. Carbon finance refers to funds generated from carbon credit transactions, which are often reinvested into climate mitigation or adaptation projects. Carbon finance supports clean energy development, forest conservation, energy access for low-income populations, climate-smart agriculture. It helps project developers overcome financing barriers and enhances the financial sustainability of climate solutions. Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. Article 6 introduces international cooperation mechanisms for carbon markets under the Paris Agreement. Article 6.2 allows bilateral trading of emission reductions between countries. Article 6.4 establishes a centralized mechanism similar to the Kyoto Protocol's Clean Development Mechanism or CDM, supervised by the UNFCCC. Article 6.8 covers non-market approaches like policy coordination and capacity building. These mechanisms aim to ensure environmental integrity, avoid double counting, and promote sustainable development. Opportunities in carbon markets. Carbon markets are increasingly seen as a finance mobilization tool for nature-based solutions (NBS) such as REDD+, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. Blue carbon initiatives, e.g. mangroves, seagrass, wetlands. Scalable technologies like direct air capture and bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, BECCS. They provide new revenue streams for developing countries and local communities, particularly in forestry, land use, and agriculture sectors. Challenges and criticisms. Despite their potential, carbon markets face significant challenges. Greenwashing. Companies may use low-quality offsets to appear climate-friendly without real emissions reductions. Additionality concerns. Some projects would have occurred without carbon finance. Inequity. Communities where projects are located may not receive fair benefits. Permanence. Forest-based credits can be lost due to fire, logging, or pests. Price volatility. Carbon credit prices vary widely, affecting project viability. Strong governance, transparency, and robust monitoring are crucial to address these issues. Emerging trends in carbon finance. Digital MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification. Blockchain and remote sensing technologies are improving transparency. Tokenized carbon credits. Digital tokens represent verified credits on blockchain networks. Corporate demand for high-quality offsets. Buyers are shifting toward credits with biodiversity and social co-benefits. National carbon registries. Countries are developing systems to track and account for international transfers under Article 6. These innovations aim to boost market integrity and accessibility. Conclusion. Carbon markets and carbon finance offer powerful tools to reduce emissions and mobilize funding for climate action. When well regulated and transparently managed, they can bridge the gap between ambition and implementation, channeling investments into sustainable, high-impact projects. As global frameworks mature under the Paris Agreement, carbon finance is poised to play an even larger role in the transition to a low-carbon world. Part 8. Institutional and governance structures in climate finance. Introduction. Effective governance and strong institutional frameworks are critical to ensure that climate finance is mobilized, allocated, and utilized effectively. Climate finance spans multiple levels, from international agreements and multilateral institutions to national governments and local stakeholders, requiring well-coordinated governance mechanisms to align finance with climate goals, especially the targets outlined in the Paris Agreement and the UN Sustainable Development Goals (SDGs). This part explores the key institutions, frameworks, and governance structures that drive the global climate finance ecosystem. International institutional architecture. 1. United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. The UNFCCC is the central platform for international climate negotiations. It oversees the implementation of agreements like Kyoto Protocol, Paris Agreement. Under the UNFCCC, climate finance is addressed in terms of commitments by developed countries to support developing countries, the operation of funding mechanisms like the Green Climate Fund, GCF, oversight of transparency and accountability mechanisms. 2. Paris Agreement and finance. Under Article 9 of the Paris Agreement, developed countries must provide financial resources to assist developing nations with both mitigation and adaptation. Climate finance should be scaled up progressively. All countries are encouraged to align financial flows with low-emission and climate-resilient development. Key multilateral climate finance institutions. 1. Green Climate Fund (GCF). Largest dedicated climate fund. Supports both mitigation and adaptation, with a special focus on vulnerable countries. Uses a range of financial instruments, grants, concessional loans, equity, guarantees. Partners with accredited entities like development banks, NGOs and UN agencies. 2. Global Environment Facility (GEF). Provides grants and blended finance to support environmental projects. Supports climate change mitigation and adaptation through multiple funding windows, including the Least Developed Countries Fund (LDCF) and the Special Climate Change Fund (SCCF). 3. Climate Investment Funds (CIF). Housed within multilateral development banks (MDBs). Includes subprograms such as the Clean Technology Fund (CTF) and Pilot Program for Climate Resilience (PPCR). Catalyzes large-scale transformation in energy and resilience sectors. 4. Adaptation Fund. Financed by carbon market proceeds and voluntary contributions. Funds projects that directly enhance climate resilience in developing countries. Role of multilateral development banks, MDBs. MDBs such as the World Bank, Asian Development Bank (ADB), African Development Bank (AFDB), and Inter-American Development Bank (IDB) play a key role by mobilizing and blending public and private capital, offering policy-based loans and technical assistance, supporting climate-smart infrastructure and institutional reform. Most MDBs have committed to aligning their portfolios with the Paris Agreement, including climate risk screening and increasing the share of climate-related finance. National-level governance structures. To access and effectively use climate finance, countries are encouraged to develop strong national institutions and frameworks including 1. National Designated Authorities (NDAs). Focal points for the GCF and other international funds. Coordinate project proposals and ensure alignment with national priorities. 2. National Climate Funds. National-level finance mechanisms that aggregate and channel climate finance. Examples: Bangladesh Climate Change Resilience Fund (BCCRF), Indonesia Climate Change Trust Fund (ICCTF). 3. National Adaptation Plans (NAPs) and Nationally Determined Contributions (NDCs). Serve as the strategic basis for climate finance programming. Outline country-specific climate targets, investment needs and financing strategies. 4. Ministries of Finance and Planning. Increasingly central to climate finance governance, particularly in integrating climate considerations into public budgets, fiscal policy and debt instruments. Climate finance readiness and capacity building. Developing countries often require support to build capacity in accessing and managing climate funds, project development and monitoring, institutional coordination, financial planning and tracking climate expenditures. Readiness programs, often supported by GCF and GEF, aim to enhance country ownership and financial governance structures. Climate finance transparency and accountability. Ensuring climate finance is used effectively, equitably and accountably requires strong systems for monitoring, reporting and verification (MRV) of climate finance flows. Transparency frameworks under the Paris Agreement. Use of climate budget tagging and tracking tools. Independent audits and community-based oversight mechanisms. The biennial transparency reports, BTRs, under the Paris Agreement provide a standardized platform for countries to report on climate finance contributions and needs. Civil society and stakeholder engagement. Governance of climate finance must be inclusive and participatory. Civil society organizations (CSOs), indigenous peoples, women's groups and youth networks contribute by advocating for equitable finance, participating in project design and implementation, monitoring projects for effectiveness and social impact, ensuring that vulnerable voices are heard in governance forums. Governance challenges and risks. Common challenges in climate finance governance include fragmentation of funds and actors, lack of coordination between ministries and sectors, weak institutional capacity, particularly in fragile states, limited absorptive capacity for large-scale finance, corruption and misuse of funds, lack of inclusive decision-making and community engagement. Addressing these challenges requires a combination of institutional reforms, capacity-building investments, and transparency-enhancing tools. Conclusion. Robust institutional and governance structures are the backbone of an effective climate finance system. They enable climate finance to flow where it is needed most, ensure its responsible use, and help build trust among stakeholders. As climate finance scales up, governance frameworks must evolve to become more transparent, inclusive and adaptive, ensuring that global climate goals are met in a fair and accountable way. Part 9. Innovations and Emerging Trends in Climate Finance. Introduction. The landscape of climate finance is evolving rapidly in response to the growing urgency of the climate crisis, advances in technology, and the expanding role of the private sector. As traditional approaches alone are not sufficient to close the climate finance gap, innovative financing mechanisms and emerging trends are playing a transformative role in scaling up and diversifying funding sources. This part explores the most promising innovations shaping the future of climate finance. Blended finance. Blended finance refers to the strategic use of public or concessional capital to de-risk and leverage private investment in climate projects. Key features. Combines public, philanthropic and private sector funds. Improves project bankability. Helps crowd in commercial capital where risks are otherwise too high. Examples. Climate Investor One (CIO), a blended finance platform supporting renewable energy infrastructure in emerging markets. Private Infrastructure Development Group (PIDG) mobilizes private investment into sustainable infrastructure. Blended finance is critical for scaling up investments in clean energy, sustainable agriculture and climate resilience. Green bonds and sustainable finance instruments. Green bonds are debt instruments used to finance projects that have positive environmental impacts, including climate mitigation and adaptation. Types of thematic bonds. Green bonds, for environmental and climate projects. Social bonds for social impact, e.g. healthcare, education. Sustainability bonds, combination of environmental and social goals. Sustainability-linked bonds, SLBs, tied to performance on ESG targets. Key players. Sovereign issuers, e.g. Chile, Nigeria, France. Development banks, e.g. World Bank, EIB. Corporates and municipalities. The green bond market has surpassed $2 trillion in cumulative issuance, becoming a mainstream investment tool. Carbon pricing and markets 2.0. New iterations of carbon pricing are being integrated into fiscal and financial planning to incentivize decarbonization. Developments. Expansion of emissions trading systems, ETS, globally. Border carbon adjustments, BCAs, proposed by the EU to address carbon leakage. Internal carbon pricing by corporations to guide investment decisions. Simultaneously, voluntary carbon markets, VCMs, are being strengthened through better standards, digital MRV and blockchain-based registries. Climate risk disclosure and ESG integration. Investors are increasingly demanding that companies disclose climate risks and align their strategies with environmental, social, and governance (ESG) principles. Key drivers. Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures (TCFD) recommendations. International Sustainability Standards Board (ISSB) framework. Mandatory disclosure regulations in the EU, UK, and other jurisdictions. Financial institutions are using climate risk data to adjust asset pricing, stress test portfolios and shift capital toward low-carbon sectors. Nature-based solutions, NBS finance. Nature-based solutions, such as afforestation, wetland restoration, and regenerative agriculture, are attracting increasing finance due to their climate, biodiversity, and community benefits. Financial innovations. Green insurance for mangrove and coral reef protection. Payment for ecosystem services pays. Blue bonds supporting marine conservation and coastal resilience. Nature-positive finance is being mainstreamed into sovereign strategies, corporate ESG plans and development finance. Climate tech and digital finance. Climate tech startups and digital platforms are unlocking new models for mobilizing climate finance. Emerging areas. Blockchain-based carbon credit platforms, e.g. Toucan Climadao. Climate fintech tools offering retail climate investments. AI and satellite-based MRV for precision tracking of emissions and project outcomes. Tokenization of green assets and fractional investing in clean energy projects. Digital innovation is making climate finance more accessible, transparent, and efficient. Resilience bonds and risk financing instruments. Resilience bonds link catastrophe insurance with climate-resilient infrastructure financing. Other innovations. Parametric insurance offering rapid payouts based on triggers like rainfall or wind speed. Catastrophe bonds transferring risk to investors. Disaster risk pooling mechanisms, e.g., African Risk Capacity, Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility. These instruments protect vulnerable countries and communities from climate shocks while enabling long-term planning. Just transition finance. A growing focus is being placed on ensuring that the shift to a low-carbon economy is fair and inclusive, especially for workers and communities dependent on high-emission industries. Key elements. Support for retraining and job creation. Investments in affected regions. Inclusion of social safeguards in climate finance. Multilateral banks, national governments and private investors are launching just transition funds and integrating equity into green finance strategies. Global climate finance initiatives and alliances. Several new global initiatives are pushing the boundaries of climate finance innovation. Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, GFANZ, a coalition of over 450 financial institutions managing $130+ trillion in assets. Network for Greening the Financial System (NGFS), central banks integrating climate risk into monetary policy. Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures (TNFD), developing a framework for biodiversity-related finance. These alliances signal a systemic shift in the global financial architecture. Conclusion: innovation is vital to meet the massive financing needs for global climate action. From blended finance and green bonds to climate fintech and nature-based solutions, the emerging trends in climate finance are reshaping how capital is mobilized and deployed. By leveraging technology, enhancing inclusivity, and integrating risk into decision-making, climate finance is becoming more dynamic, transparent, and impactful. Part 10: The Future of Climate Finance. Introduction. The coming decades will determine the trajectory of climate change and its impacts on the planet. As the climate crisis deepens, the role of climate finance is becoming not only more prominent but more urgent. The future of climate finance lies in scaling up, innovating, and transforming the global financial system to make it fit for a climate-resilient, net-zero world. This part explores future directions, challenges, and transformative opportunities in climate finance. The scale of the challenge. According to the UNFCCC and IEA, trillions of dollars are needed annually to meet climate goals. $4-6 trillion per year to transition to a low-carbon economy. A significant increase in adaptation finance, especially for vulnerable countries. At least $100 billion per year pledged by developed nations for climate finance is only a floor, not a ceiling. Closing this gap requires mobilizing public, private, and philanthropic capital at an unprecedented scale. Aligning the global financial system. To meet climate targets, the entire financial ecosystem must be realigned with climate objectives. Key focus areas. Making climate risk a core component of financial decision-making. Reorienting capital flows towards sustainable investments. Enforcing mandatory climate-related financial disclosures. Reforming financial institutions to become climate-smart by design. Initiatives like Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement explicitly call for making finance flows consistent with a pathway toward low greenhouse gas emissions and climate-resilient development. Expanding access and equity. Climate finance in the future must be more inclusive and equitable. What needs to change? Ensuring easier access for developing countries, small island states, and least developed countries, LDCs. Directing more funds to locally led adaptation and community-driven projects. Removing complex application barriers for small and indigenous organizations. Increasing support for loss and damage finance as climate impacts worsen. Equity, justice, and local empowerment will be cornerstones of effective climate finance going forward. Unlocking private sector potential. The private sector holds the majority of global capital and will play a pivotal role in climate finance. Opportunities include mainstreaming ESG into all investment and lending decisions. Expanding the green and sustainability bond market. Scaling up public-private partnerships (PPPs). Integrating climate considerations into corporate governance.